Thank you, John and Melissa and John Evan for inviting me to come to Milwaukee and to be with you tonight, celebrating the work of the Wisconsin Equal Justice Fund. Critical work. My roots are in legal services. I began practicing in North Idaho in the late 70s. Our firm was spun off from California Indian Legal Services in 1969. The Native American Rights Fund still honors its relationship with Indian legal services programs around the country. And what we have always said about Indian legal services is that on many Indian reservations, even today, after the positive effects of gaming in Indian country, on many Indian reservations, Indian legal services programs are the only game in town. There is simply no access to legal representation without the work of folks like Wisconsin Judicare. So I'm here tonight to bestow upon my dear friend, James Botsford, the Eisenberg Lifetime Achievement Award, and I think it's very fitting that James receives this award. I think he's well known to EJF. He's been on the board of directors here for about a decade, I think, until his recent retirement from Judicare. He received the Distinguished Service Award 4 years ago from the organization. But I think it's wonderful that he is the first recipient of the Eisenberg Award given to a Native American advocate in Wisconsin. I think the thing that I can say about James that captures the essence of his work probably goes back to what I learned about him in his formative years. He left home before he dropped out of high school and left home and went to live in Europe and the Middle East for several years on his own, working his way around, hitchhiking, and I think James developed early on a sense of resourcefulness, a good sense of common sense, and became, I think, through those formative years, very effective problem solver. Is that Rudy Giuliani calling? Because the thing about our work at the Native American Rights Fund, we're a national practice in scope, and we get calls from attorneys all over the country looking for us to assist them in litigation. We were involved in the fishing rights cases in Wisconsin, the treaty fishing rights cases in Michigan, and the Bolt decision in Washington State, for example. And so, and all of these cases had connections to legal services, interestingly enough. So when we started getting calls from a guy named Jim Botsford in Nebraska in 1984, at first we thought he was a little harebrained. He called us and said, well, I'm representing the Winnebago tribe in Nebraska. They want to do something that no other tribe living under the effects of Public Law 280 has done, and that is restore criminal jurisdiction to their tribe. James was in his first year out of law school. We thought to ourselves, because I was at that meeting, and we said, this hasn't been done. It's really not something that's easily accomplished. It's going to take the cooperation of the governor and the state legislature in Nebraska. But somehow Botsford talked us into it, and a couple years later, the Winnebago tribe had successfully retroceded jurisdiction and now has criminal jurisdiction, misdemeanor jurisdiction over its tribal members. A long and sordid history behind the need to do that. Now, James didn't stop there. He then called us and said, well, we've got a problem. 600 human remains, sets of human remains of Pawnee ancestors in the Nebraska Hysterical Society, we called it in those days. We've got to do something about that. So we we latched our fortune and our wagon to James, and 2 years later we had a law passed in Nebraska that permitted the repatriation of those remains, one of the first state law repatriation statutes in the United States. And we reburied those 660 Pawnee ancestors in central Nebraska in the late 80s, a couple of years before the enactment of the National Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a sea change in federal human rights legislation for Native Americans, passed in 1990. James didn't stop there. He was involved and instrumental in the enactment of Indian child protection laws in Nebraska, and then brought that experience with him to Wisconsin. He got involved here in Wisconsin in the creation of the Wisconsin Tribal Chairmen's Association, the 11 tribes in Wisconsin, and began to create a dialogue between tribal chairmen and state court judges that led in part to the Teague Protocol, notions of comedy between tribal court decisions and state court decisions, a remarkable achievement in our work. One would think that it would not be that difficult and that groundbreaking an effort, but it's simply the fact nationwide tribal judges and state court judges don't talk to each other. That's not the case now in Wisconsin, and again, groundbreaking advocacy effort on the part of James and others. His work on the National Association of Indian Legal Services, working with me and other legal services program directors around the country, an effort to keep, in the mid-90s, to keep the Legal Services Corporation alive. Some of you may remember those times, and the effort by Newt Gingrich to eliminate the Legal Services Corporation. NARF, in fact, lost the national support funding in the mid-90s. We were working in Senator Wellstone's office back in those days to keep funding for the Legal Services Corporation alive. Today, in part due to the work of James and a handful of other people, Indian Legal Services programs now have about $2 million a year in funding, supplemental funding from the Department of Justice for tribal court development and representation in tribal court. And James was right there, working shoulder to shoulder with us. And I think one of the capstone, a couple different things. In 1994, federal legislation to protect the rights of Native people to use peyote for religious and ceremonial purposes. We worked with James on that. And then I think the capstone of his career before retirement in the last few years, working with Judge Rash from Stockbridge, Muncie, who's here tonight, member of the Judicare Board. Indigenous peacemaking, the restoration of traditional forms of dispute resolution in Indian country, which go beyond mediation, which often involve a very important spiritual component to healing the families in Indian country, healing relationships, healing from the historical trauma, as Dave can speak very passionately about, that has befallen Indian country and led to generations of abuse. And Indian tribes and Indian communities are trying to shake that off and come back from that. And James and Dave and others here in Wisconsin have been, again, at the national forefront in leading the effort to restore indigenous justice to Native communities. So I could go on and on. He also writes great poetry. He builds great outhouses, which he's doing now in his retirement. And I think he's got a car if you want an outhouse. He's got 40. But if you would join me in welcoming James Botts.